They're being introduced like that. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight. It's been a great night so far with our brother Emmanuel kicking us off tonight, and it was also a great night last night with lessons from our brother David and Mark. I'm honoured to be invited back to speak at Young Men of God meetings. It's been a couple of years now, I think. 2019 or 2018? One of those ones. A while ago. It was the last time I spoke at one of these meetings, and I have to say the crowd is looking a lot grayer this year. And that's always a fear with the Young Men of God, that it's not inclusive enough. But Adam showed me the list of speakers for next year, and I think we're going for a Young at Heart theme next year. Well, many of you will be. Anyway. I'm happy to be back, and I hope that you're encouraged by the message that I have to bring to you tonight. Jeremiah 29, verses 11 to 12. That is the passage that was given to me. It says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you." Calling the Father. That is the title for the final lesson in this When a Plan Comes Together series. The idea that when we make a plan in our lives and God is at the forefront of our minds, we will be able to make success that He intends for us. A few months ago, Adam sent me the outline for this lesson, and I immediately started to interpret this title with the passage in so many different ways. But the very first thing that it got me thinking about is having the right relationship with God. You see, a lot of the times I think we fall into the habit of making our relationship with God a get out of jail card. In fact, we find ourselves calling on Him when we are lost and we have no idea where we're going next. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We should definitely be calling to God in those moments, but it's almost as though God's our backup plan. We have everything planned out in our own lives, and sometimes it goes wrong, and that's when we say, like, God, I need you to bail me out this one. And that's just not a healthy relationship to have with God. God shows us throughout the Bible what type of relationship He wants us to have. We see throughout the Bible an intimate relationship between Him and His people. If you look in the Old Testament, one of my favourite relationships is God and Enoch. God and Enoch's relationship is a special one. Enoch's only mentioned 5 times in the Bible, and 3 of them are just in the context of genealogy. But there are 2 other separate occasions where Enoch is mentioned in the Bible where a little bit more is said about his character. So if we turn to Genesis chapter 5. Genesis chapter 5 talks about the genealogy of Noah, and it's important to know the detail of the structure of these verses. You know, each of the verses mentions somebody's name, their age, their child, and all the verses end with the same phrase, "and he died." Now let's read what it says about when it talks about Enoch. Verse 21, it says, "When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God, and then he was no more because God took him away." So Enoch is one of 2 men in the Bible who never died. It simply says that he was no more. I like the way that the Message in the Good News translation puts verse 24. The Message says, "Enoch walked steadily with God, and then one day he was simply gone. God took him." And the Good News translation says, "He spent his life in fellowship with God, and then he disappeared because God took him away." I like the word fellowship there because I think it allows us to get a much clearer picture of the type of relationship that they had. You know, we get the idea that God couldn't wait for Enoch to die, and not in a morbid way. No, God loved Enoch so much that and his relationship meant a lot to him. Graham preached not so long ago, and he put it like this: every waking minute of Enoch's life, God spent talking with him. And the only time that the conversations really stopped is when Enoch had to go to sleep. And you can imagine every night while Enoch is sleeping, God just can't wait, like a child on Christmas Eve for the next morning so that they can continue the conversation and pick up where they left off. We get the same sort of idea when Enoch is mentioned again in Hebrews chapter 11 verse 5. It reads, "By faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him." Now before he was taken, he was commended as having pleasing God. Again, a great translation in the Message, it says, "By an act of faith Enoch skipped death completely. He looked all over and could not find him because God had taken him away." And that's all that's said about Enoch really in the Bible. Two very short passages, but what a way to have your name cemented in the Bible. To have such a relationship with God that all you can talk about is your faith. I get the idea that you would need a whole other Bible just to cover the relationship that they had. And ultimately that's what we want. When it's all said and done, we want to hear, wow, wow, you were truly faithful. So from Enoch, we can see what type of relationship is pleasing to God. And the only way we can achieve this type of relationship is to put him in the forefront of everything we do. And once we've established this type of relationship with God, we can rely on him making a direct impact in our lives. However, we've got to realise that God is not just a genie in the bottle waiting to grant our every request. Jeremiah says, "I know the plans that I, God, have for you." And we have to trust that he has plans for us to prosper and not to harm us. And that can be a struggle at times, to have that type of trust in God, that he's always going to be there for us. But how can we deny a God who's given everything and sacrificed his only son so that we can have the free will to come to him? Free will, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, think of it. Those of you with children, there's a good few of you here. I'm sure we all have that one person in our lives that we just wish would come to God. A family member or a friend. I want you to imagine you're having a discussion with this individual and they say to you, "Hey Adam, I just don't know how committed you are to your faith, but you know what would convince me? What might convince me? Not 100%, but it might sway me. Is if you're willing to sacrifice Nicole for your faith, then maybe you can start to convince me how important your faith is. Adam, Nicole's not here, so you can give your honest answer. Is that something you'd be willing to do?
Sacrifice my daughter to prove my faith.
Yeah.
This one counts.
No. Are you sure? Did you consider it for even a second? She's not here. No. Would it make you consider it even more if the person even told you that 100% I would commit my life to Jesus if you sacrifice your own daughter? Would it commit you even more? Well, that's what God did for us. So how can we not trust him to make an impact in our lives? Now we all have goals and plans in our life, and if we put God at the centre of it all, we can expect clear responses from him. Yes, slow, or grow. We'll have a look at these examples in the Bible in just a moment. But whatever response that we receive from God, we should know it's for the better, although at the time we may not understand. Let's look at the first response. And it's the one that we're all looking for, yes. Let's turn to Daniel chapter 3. At this time, King Nebuchadnezzar has just made a golden image and declared that at the sound of any sort of music that everyone should bow down and worship the image, and anyone who refuses to worship the image will be cast into the fiery furnace. And Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego refused to worship this idol. So let's read from verses 16 to 20. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer to you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. So if we jump to verse 24 to 27, we see that God immediately responds to their prayer. It says, "Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, 'Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire?' They answered and said to the king, 'True, O king.' 'Look,' he answered, 'I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God.' Then Nebuchadnezzar went near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, 'Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here.' Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the midst of the fire, and the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hairs on their heads were not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them." So there we see God immediately answer yes to their prayer. No harm came to those 3 men, and also at that time King Nebuchadnezzar recognizes the one and true God, which was definitely part of God's plans for 3 of them. The next response, slow. In Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis chapter 12 we are introduced to Abraham and Sarai. We're told that Sarai is barren and unable to have children, and God comes to Abraham and makes him a promise. Verses 1 to 4. "Now the Lord had said to Abraham, 'Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all families of the earth shall be blessed.' So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abraham was 75 years old when he departed from Haran." So Abraham is promised by God at the age of 75 that he will make him a great nation. Although it's not directly said in this passage, we know that God's talking about blessing him with a child. And he's telling Abraham that his wife, who at the time was around 65, would bear children, which is a little crazy, you know. It'd be like, you get the idea. But nevertheless, Abraham trusts God and does what is required of him. Now, it's not until chapter 17 and 25 years later when God fulfills the promise. Even by that time, Abraham has doubts. Chapter 17, verse 17. "Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, 'Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?' You know, it's even crazier now. He's 100 years old and Sarah's 90. So that'd be like, God fulfills his promise to Abraham, but it's definitely not the timescale that Abraham would have wanted or even predicted. You know, 25 years later, but he trusts God and he keeps him close to him, and ultimately God comes through. One thing I will add to the slow response is that it's not really a slow response. It's just that sometimes as humans we get impatient. God does not work slowly. Sometimes we just need to slow down. We often rush into things. But there's a time for everything, and God's timing is perfect, it says in Ephesians. And to add to that, we have 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. "The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance." Sometimes we just need to let go and let God take control, no matter how long it takes. And our final response, grow. It's a bit of a more difficult one to explain, but we'll be moving to Genesis chapter 37 and looking at the story of Joseph. Graham already knew I was going there. He likes to joke that every time I preach I always have to mention Joseph, and it's true. And somehow his life just applies to everything, or at least I try to make it apply. I'm not going to dive deeply into the story or read the whole story of Joseph. We all know the story, but as I was preparing for this lesson, I had a thought. You know, Joseph was sold into captivity by his brothers, and I was just thinking, you know, while Joseph was on that road to Egypt, he must have been afraid, and he must have been praying to God non-stop to bring him back home to his dad. We know the type of relationship that Joseph had with his father, a very close bond, and that's what ultimately led him to being betrayed by his brothers. Joseph, I imagine, would have prayed many times to God to help him find his way back to his dad and take him back home. But God doesn't respond by turning the camel around and sending Joseph back home, as I'm sure he would have wanted to. No, God doesn't give Joseph directly what I believe he would have wanted. He arrives in Egypt and he's there for 13 years before he even sees his dad again. Nevertheless, Joseph stays focused on God and goes through many challenges during his time in Egypt, from becoming a slave, falsely accused, and jailed, and even forgotten about. Joseph tells the butler not to forget about him when he's free, and to tell Pharaoh about their encounter so that he can be set free. So once the butler is set free, I can just imagine, Joseph is feeling anxious, he's excited, he thinks everything's going to be fine. The butler will tell Pharaoh about the story and he'll be free in no time. But no, a whole 2 years pass before the butler remembers Joseph and he's finally set free. That feeling as well must have been gutting, in that scenario, to be forgotten about. And although these things are difficult for any human to experience, it was ultimately time for Joseph to grow in his relationship with God. You see throughout every trial, Joseph kept calling to God. And this is just part of my own thoughts, but I feel like God knew how much Joseph loved his dad and all of his brothers, and God also knew that there was a great famine coming and that it was going to greatly affect his hometown. So although while Joseph was on the way to Egypt, he may have been pleading with God to get him out of this mess, to return home, God knew that was not the place that Joseph needed to be. God knew that Joseph being in Egypt would one day greatly benefit not only Joseph but his family. And as it happened, famine hit, and Joseph was in a position of power to provide for his family when they needed it. Not only was he in a position of power, but he found the power to forgive his brothers for what they did for him and welcome them back with open arms. Maybe if the butler didn't forget about Joseph when he was released from prison 2 years earlier, maybe he wouldn't have had the same level of maturity to find that forgiveness for his brothers. But one thing we do know is that being betrayed by his own brothers was not part of Joseph's plan. Being separated from his father for 13 years was definitely not part of his plan. But God had bigger plans for him, and he needed him to grow. Through all the trials, Joseph kept God at the forefront of his mind, and his life turned out better than he could ever imagine. And again, we see through Joseph's ability to interpret, we see that Pharaoh recognizes Joseph as a man of the true God. So there are some examples of the yes, the slow, and the go responses that we can see from God. And also there are great examples of when a plan comes together, but more specifically when God's plan comes together. God has a plan for all of us, and He will make an impact in our lives if we allow Him, by keeping Him in focus throughout our lives. God used all these men to achieve great things. However, they all received very different responses from God. But there's a common thread in all of their stories, which is God. All these men had God at the forefront of their minds, and God blessed them. So as we go through life and we make plans and decisions for ourselves, let us involve God and allow His plan to work through us. We may not always get the response that we want, but we will get the response that we need. Let us allow God to make a difference in our lives.